Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this RSE Gifford Seminar. We are also online as well, and this is being live streamed. So thank you for coming along, and it's an honour and a privilege to be welcoming this year's Gifford lecturer, Professor Alexandra Walsham. The title of her Gifford series is up there, Motion and Emotion in Early Modern Christian History. Before I say something about the lectures, the RSE, and also the Gifford series, a few basic housekeeping points. Please note that there is no fire alarm scheduled for today. If the alarm does sound, please exit back to the way you came in. There are RSE personnel all over the building, so if you need any help from anyone, please reach out. And there will be on hand to help and guide you if there is a fire alarm. You will also have an opportunity to ask questions. This is a fireside chat lecture event. So if you do want to ask questions, we will have questions both online and in person. Just raise your hand and there will be a microphone that will go around. Out of respect for the speakers, please put your phone onto either silent or switch it off completely. My name is Mona Siddiqui, and I am a professor at the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm joined by Professor Alex Walsham, but also Professor Scott Spurlock and Professor David Jasper. They will form part of the panel that will give some immediate thoughts to Professor Walsham's lectures, but also they will be part of the interactive discussion amongst themselves, but also with yourselves. The RSE, as many of you know, is Scotland's national academy, and it supports, recognises and mobilises expertise from across academia, business and public service for the benefit of Scotland and the wider world. Our fellows, our elected fellows, are all from academia, business and public service, and are recognised as some of the most distinguished in their fields. The RSE and the University of Edinburgh unite annually to present the RSE Gifford Seminar, providing a unique overview of the Gifford Lecture Series. So bear in mind, this seminar is not another lecture, but an interactive session where you can engage with the speaker on their series, fostering fresh thinking. The Gifford Lectures themselves were established in 1887 under the will of Adam Lord Gifford, a judge of the Court of Session and a man of broad interests and compassion. The Gifford Lectures are held at each year, or every other year, at each of the 4 ancient Scottish universities. And for over a century, the lectures have enabled an eminent field of scholars to advanced philosophical and scientific thought. Just a few words about Professor Walsham's lectures, and then I'll invite her to come up and give you 15 to 20 minutes as an overview of the main themes. Mobility is both a central feature of human experience and a rich metaphor for the dynamic role that religion plays in the making of history. In our globalized world, people, objects, organisms, and ideas travel through space and time at speed. These movements help to create opportunities, foster relationships, and forge identities. But they are also a perennial source of unease, anxiety, and danger. The turbulence that surrounds us in everyday life is mirrored by the turmoil that so many feel inside. The 2025 Gifford Lectures explores these themes in the context of early modern Christianity, examining the piety, ethics, and politics of physical movement in tandem with the internal transformations precipitated by the Reformations. They probe the connections between motion and emotion and illuminate the origins and impact of the profound religious upheavals of the period between 1500 to 1800. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Professor Alex Walsham.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mona, for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It has been quite an intense couple of weeks, but enormously stimulating, and I've been very grateful for the stimulating questions that people have asked. So, as Mona said, and I'm going to kind of reiterate a little bit of that summary that she provided, these lectures have looked at the theme of religious movements, movements in multiple senses of the word. And I've also tried to explore the connections between motion and emotion in the past, and particularly in the period between 1500 to 1800. And movement is a very powerful theme because it resonates so much with the world in which we live now, when people, objects, organisms, and ideas travel through time and space at speed. Movement creates opportunities, fosters relationships, builds networks, and forges identities. But it is also a source of great unease, anxiety, and even anger. It poses problems to governments and societies. It's the source of moral dilemmas, and it provokes questions of conscience and crises of faith. We're surrounded by turbulence and flux in the outside world, but we're also a society marked by the internal turmoil that so many people feel, and which is, as we all know, in the midst of a mental health crisis that is both broad and deep. I've explored these themes in the period between the 15th and the 18th centuries, the era of the Reformations, a major rupture in Christian history, which saw the fragmentation of Christendom and which has had enduring consequences and left lasting legacies. I've looked at these questions of politics, ethics, and piety in tandem with the internal transformations that took place in hearts and souls, bodies and minds. And I've tried to illuminate in new ways the origin, the agency, and the impact of religious change. The Reformation split the Christian world into different confessional strands, sects, and churches, and had explosive consequences. They converged with state formation and political developments. They led to rebellions, revolts, revolutions, and wars of religion. They stimulated mass migration into exile and a search for asylum. They were also entangled with the rise of empire and with mercantile expansion and commerce, one side effect of which was the development of slavery. At the same time, European societies were seeking solutions to the perceived growth of crime and poverty, and those solutions included transportation of convicts overseas and the regulation of the wandering poor, of rogues, vagabonds, gypsies, and demobilized soldiers. It also converged and coincided with significant intellectual developments that were reconfiguring what movement meant, how God operated in the world, and the mechanisms by which he did so: miracles, providence, human agency, chance, and nature, which came into focus in moments of catastrophe and disaster, especially, such as earthquakes. It was a period that saw shifts in the conceptualization of the Earth's place in the universe, from being at its center to revolving around the sun. It was also accompanied by developments in understanding about the affects and the passions, the words that contemporaries used for emotion. And the motions of affects and passions were critical elements in the health of the body and the soul. They were understood to be the product of literal movement that took place in the human heart. This was a society and a culture in which there was a close link between the somatic and the spiritual, and between cognition and emotion. It was a holistic vision that was beginning to be challenged by philosophical developments, including Cartesian rationalism, but also by evolving notions of the role of the passions and of associated shifts in emotional temper, tone, and sensibility. And it saw the beginning of transpositions that led eventually to the separation of religion from science and their construction as distinct fields of inquiry. It catalysed powerful evangelical impulses, worldwide mission to convert people to Christianity, to reclaim those who'd abandoned their faith for other churches or faiths, including Judaism and Islam, and to intensify the piety of those for whom Christianity was their birthright. Clergy and laity alike strove to inculcate a faith that was more than nominal and lukewarm, and that was passionate and zealous. What they sought was a feeling faith. They wanted their hearts to melt and to burn in the love of Christ. They wanted to feel moved. The Reformations also prompted religious movements in the modern sense of the word, concerted and collective efforts to effect religious change and transform the world. I'm not going to say much about that because that's the subject of my lecture, final lecture, tomorrow evening. Movement is particularly well suited to serve as a tool for exploring the Reformations, I think. And that is a development, the Reformation, that acquired its status as an event retrospectively. It existed as an event less at the time that it occurred than in subsequent memory. For those who experienced it, it was fluid, plural, dynamic, and mobile. Its birth date and its endpoint were contested. Many wanted the Reformations that they witnessed to go further or to be reversed. They were all too aware of the contingency and vulnerability of these arrangements to change and of their potential to be subverted, cancelled, or aggressively repressed. Reformation was something that happened in churches, states, and societies, but it also happened within the realm of the soul, where it was often an elusive goal. When Reformation, regeneration, or conversion came, it was accompanied by outpourings of emotion, by powerful feelings that manifested themselves in bodily form. But it was also surrounded by doubt and anxiety, by worries about sincerity, by fears of self-deceit, and by concerns that one's experiences were not the result of the operations of the Holy Spirit, but rather the machinations of Satan. People read their emotions as evidence of their salvation or as signs of damnation. They were perturbed and even tormented by the possibility that they could not truly believe. The restlessness at the heart of Christianity in this period is striking, but it was hardly new. It's part of a perennial cycle in which Christians try to recover the purity and zeal of their faith in its apostolic infancy. They do so convinced that it's declined in intensity and lost its original essence, which must be recovered if it is to flourish. They believe that success and prosperity has bred apathy and indifference. They look to the past to find inspiration to change the present and rethink the future. The scholarly instinct that's defined my career has been an attempt to push back against self-congratulatory teleologies and linear narratives that oversimplify the complexities and the contingencies of history. I've done this in several different spheres and in relation to a variety of themes. In relation to providentialism, the supernatural, and the disenchantment of the world, pushing back against the idea that ideas of divine intervention were marginalised and that there was what Keith Thomas called a decline of magic. I've also looked at the persisting patterns of sacralisation and desacralisation in the history of the impact of the Reformation on space, place, and landscape. This has also been a motif in my work on religious persecution, coexistence, and toleration. The alleged rise of toleration was ambivalent and contested, I've argued. I've emphasised instead the symbiotic relationship and interplay between tolerance and intolerance and its paradoxical quality. I've presented both persecution and toleration as forms of charitable hatred. More recently, these same preoccupations have led me to think about the generations and generational change, the archetype of cyclical movement through time, as the young grow to adulthood and then to old age, as each generation has children and grandchildren who successively replace them. Critical in this are again the workings of memory. Memory and the generations involve the intertwining of the experience of individual lives with the experience of larger historical developments. My interest in mobility springs from my interest in tracing what John Bossy once called the migrations of the holy. I strongly stress in all my work continuity across the early modern period, as well as connections with the medieval centuries and with developments beyond the era of my specialisation into the modern period. Some will think, and indeed I have said in print, that I tend to privilege continuity over change. I've confessed in an article that doing justice to change over time is probably my Achilles heel as a historian. But my instinctive reluctance to highlight rupture comes from a strong sense that people experience change gradually and cumulatively, and that its effects are often only realized after the event. I seek to try to capture its nuances and ambiguities. I seek to try to capture cultures in motion and mentalities on the move. My turn to mobility and the emotions reflects wider trends within the humanities and social sciences, which themselves resonate with the preoccupations and priorities of our own time. I'm interested in agency and the power of physical movement and of internal feeling in history. And I want to explore how we write a history of religious belief as an experience of believing by self-conscious subjects. I'm just going to say a couple more words about the methodological assumptions that I've brought to this series of lectures, which I've not been overt about because I've tried to engage with a general audience. One thing I do want to highlight is the importance of language. I've paid very close attention to language, to how the interconnections between the words motion and emotion and the etymological affinity between them has been a real starting point for where I have gone with these lectures. I think of language as a seismograph, a barometer, a gauge, and a register that doesn't just describe what happens in hearts, minds, and the wider world, but that also shapes them. It affects and it affects them. And it's a key to opening up how people thought and what they felt. I think history as a discipline is pulled in two directions. It's pulled between the empirical task of reconstructing the past and pursuing the truth, but it's also exploring, it's underpinned by this idea that we have a duty to understand the past on its own terms, a duty of empathy, if you like, an imperative of endeavouring to understand people who held very different assumptions to our own, which we may find puzzling, distasteful, even abhorrent, and of which we might disapprove. Our job is not to pass judgment on their opinions or their conduct, or indeed to diagnose their mental and bodily ills, but it's rather to try to see things their way. There's a danger of a reductionist approach to the history of religion, one that is functionalist and utilitarian, that's focused on thinking about the purposes that belief served. It's rooted in modern secular assumptions that religion is something that can be detached from other parts of one's existence. My response to this is that we need to write a social history of the Reformation and of religion with the theology put back. And I think that the history of emotion has a part to play in this. There are certainly methodological challenges surrounding the history of emotions, including the question of whether they're timeless and what role physiology and biology play in the forms they take, a question that had its roots in the period I've been exploring itself, how far they're socially constructed, and their relationship with culture, and the issue of feeling as both cognitive and embodied. But I think that emotion still represents a valuable tool with which, and a lens through which, we can examine these questions and probe the experience and the subjectivity of people in the past. I picked up on many of the approaches pioneered by scholars such as Barbara Rosenwein, William Reddy, Rob Bodis, and Monique Shear, but I've also tried to bring some new thoughts and perspectives of my own. So finally, I think we need a reflective approach to history. We need to think about the lingering shadow cast by the categories and binaries that we've inherited, and those include the binary between reason and emotion, intellect and affect, thinking and feeling. Those paradigms and polarities are the product of the developments in the period I've been exploring itself. They're linked with both the Reformations and the theological and philosophical currents that flowed into it, and with the Enlightenment. And here I've seen the latter, the Enlightenment, as a product of the long Reformation. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome our two panelists who will be in conversation with Professor Alex, Professor David Jasper and Professor Scott Spurlock. Please give a round welcome applause. Anyway, I'll sit here. Thank you so much. Before we open it out, I just want to ask each of our panelists, first of all, to say a little bit about your own work, but also how you think your work ties in with some of the things that Professor Walsham has said, or your immediate thoughts to anything she said. And I'll start with you, Scott.
Okay, I'm Professor of Scottish and Early Modern Christianities at the University of Glasgow, and I've been taken by the remarkable survey that Professor Walsham has given to us. For those of us who live in the early modern world, it has been challenging in terms of its depth and its scope, but it's also been pitched at a level that's been accessible to those who are living in the 21st century. I personally, apart from the significance of better understanding the possibilities within the early modern religious landscape that fostered the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, I think it's been a very timely lecture to remind us of the place that religion holds within societies, how it is shaped and molded by other factors, but also how you've engaged it with very little discussion of politics, which has generally dominated our understanding of the Reformation period, and the shift and impulse towards motion, emotion, conversion, movement, I think has allowed us to think about the space that religion inhabits in societies in different ways.
Thank you. I'll let you respond when they've both spoken. Professor Jasper.
Thank you very much. My name is David Jasper, and I'm Emeritus Professor from the University of Glasgow. I'm not a historian. I was a professor of theology and literature, and that's kind of the way into my response to your remarkably wide-ranging lectures that embrace so much. And to add to that, the term theology you did use this evening, but on the whole, the term has been religion rather than theology. And I wonder whether that prompts a thought as to the role of theology and its hugely political, antagonistic debates in the Reformation, and how that relates to what, in a certain sense, you portrayed as the increasingly emotional. Thank you. Increasingly emotional understanding of religion. You talked this evening about feeling faith. And that very often, by the time you get to the end of the 18th century, into the 19th century, is associated with a very anti-intellectual evangelicalism, and how theology, in fact, is part of the story that you're telling. Also, given that theology, generally speaking, in practice is quite a conservative force. And on the whole, and it was certainly true in the Reformation too, while great changes politically were taking place, often people were profoundly unwilling to shift and change their religious practices and beliefs. One thinks, for example, of the opposition to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer in 1549, where people were unwilling to shift at all, and how you would, as it were, fit that kind of theological anchor into the increasingly shifting portrait that you give of the Reformation.
I'll let you have a few words.
Thank you so much. Do I need to use this?
Maybe just to be on the safe side.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'll say a little about politics first. And actually it relates to what I might say in response to the other question. And that is that, as you said, politics of the Reformation is often about the construction of confessional blocks, of rigid boundaries, of frontiers, and that is in some ways imposing a kind of rigidity on a very fast-moving set of currents and rivers. And what I said earlier about, we think, and our history books tell us, that the Reformation is an event, but actually people at the time could not have known the end point of that. And so they're living in a moving, it's a train in motion, isn't it? And that's what I think I'm trying to capture. Theology, as you said, also has this idea of a kind of dogmatic body of ideas that's fixed and that's almost divinely ordained. But it's not like that, is it? And I think, I said earlier that I like to think about what I do as writing a social and cultural history of religion with the theology put back. I think a lot of what's happened in the history, in ecclesiastical history or in the history of religion, has been an evacuation of ideas and beliefs. And those ideas have power and agency, but they're also fluid and evolving and changing. And I think theology, therefore, has to be kind of put in the context of, it is itself a part of lived religion. It is a thing that is evolving and changing and dynamically developing. So I hope that what I'm trying to do is sort of move away from models of writing religious history that are about the sort of fossilized, fixed and rigid structures that churches, create, towards recapturing the kind of fluidity and restlessness that people who lived through those events experienced. I hope that's enough. Go on. Yeah.
Do you want to come in?
Yep. Of course.
I'll use this just to be safe. I was struck reading this, listening to these lectures, by the contemporary significance of this. So in some sense, when you start a study of the Reformation with the political, you end up with hegemonic ecclesiastical structures, you end up with rigid confessional frameworks that hold sway for 500 years. Yeah. And we find ourselves in increasingly secular contexts where those institutions are disintegrating, and the space of theological discourse or religious conversation is freer from those dogmatic expectations than they were in the past. And in the current media interest, I think there's two strands that are really interesting. One is the turn of people like Richard Dawkins or Tom Holland towards a kind of cultural Christianity. They can accept that now that the institutions are wavering. But also the recent book by Lamorna Ash, which has explored different expressions of young Christian faith, people actually finding Christianity that they didn't anticipate to find. What does what you're telling us about the early modern period give us insight into what might happen next?
It's not a small question, is it? Well, you know, I think I might go back to the kind of rather cyclical models that I've, you know, drawn attention to, that I don't see history as a linear thing. I see it more cyclically. And I think that what I've been struck by is how, you know, there is this recurrent attempt to recapture the feeling and the intensity of a moment in the past. And that goes along with, you know, once you institutionalize things, there's a perception that you've lost the essence of that, and there's an attempt then to recapture it. And I think, in a way, maybe what we are seeing is a kind of crisis of the institutions, of state, of churches, of everything, really. And in that sense, you know, we're part of this sort of ongoing cycle or phase. I'm not, you know, a historian, I'm not a prophet, so I don't know what the future holds, but I do think that, and it's not our job to do that, but I think it does make us think critically about, you know, where we've come from, what the present is like, and where things might go in the future. Yeah.
I wonder if I could just pick up on what you've just said, but also what Scott was saying about institutions and churches, and just revise a little the notion that they're kind of rigid and that theology is rigid. Because it seems to me that you might equally say that a church or an institution and its theology provides a framework in which the notion, for example, of space is just simply changed. So, for instance, if we have a theology that lays great emphasis on eschatology, and in fact that the journey we're making is a journey into the next life, into the beyond, that's a very real notion of change and movement, but it's quite different, or perhaps somewhat different, from the journey that is made by, say, a religious migrant into a different country for one reason or another. So, in fact, change and motion becomes very multi-layered. It's happening at different speeds and in different ways for each individual within each different institution. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I have tried in these lectures to be conscious of the multiple scales and levels, and of, you know, of movement in multiple senses, movement as turning, movement as linear, movement as upheaval and turning the world upside down, all of these things, and they're constantly kind of coexisting. I mean, theology, I use that word advisedly, but also loosely, and I think, you know, human behaviour is theology in action. You know, another of the polarities that I push back against is the polarity of behaviour and belief. I think those things, you know, interact with each other, and you know, what my training as a historian, shaped by social sciences and other ideas, but also by, I hope, a sensitivity to theology, is, you know, that those are not distinctions that we can, you know, we can hold too closely. Otherwise, we do violence to the past.
I just wanted to ask you something outside of this current discussion, which is about migration and change. Do you think that most change is in some way linked to migration? Most of the biggest changes that we go through in life? Whether it's moving a house or moving a job, it doesn't have to be moving continents. But is change, the biggest changes, are they to do with displacing yourself somewhere else?
Yes, I think I probably would agree with that. And I think, you know, it's not just simply about displacing yourself physically, but it's about, you know, changing, you know, your outlook, your direction, and so on. So yeah, I think mobility is enormously creative and productive, but it's also quite dangerous, isn't it, and ambivalent. And but that's the kind of paradox at the heart of human life, really, I think, isn't it?
So I would just to add that, I would say that maybe the word that's lacking is also risk, and the importance of risk when we think about change and mobility, that we want to take risk. Risk isn't something dangerous. We can be very content in a place, but we want to take the risk to change things. And what is it that drives that desire to change?
I don't know. I think it's just who we are as human beings, isn't it, really? Perhaps we should ask the audience too.
We're going to open it out to any questions as well. Bear in mind that there are questions online as well. So for those of you who are online, please do type your question or comment in the chats. There are roving mics for anyone who wants to ask a question, and please do make it a question. Thank you.
You talked about in your methodology approach the focus on language and the importance of language when it comes to emotion. As one of the big impacts of the Reformation was the democratization of religion into people's spoken language. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about how the difference between language could impact people's different experience with the Reformation? So, you know, going from a centralized Latin, you know, explaining how to feel about religion to, say, your German approach to religion or your English approach to religion or even Italian.
Thank you. That's such an interesting question. Yeah, of course, the Reformation is famously about people having access to scripture and to the liturgy in their own tongues. Those trends predate the Reformation. They're already in humanism before that, but they're really strengthened by the priorities of the Reformation. You know, the priesthood of all believers. To be a priesthood, you must understand the scripture and access it yourself. And I think that does make a big difference. You know, it's about encounter with the Word of God. And it also means that people, and this is at the heart of the challenge of the Reformation, can then interpret that themselves. So, you know, a good example of this is Luther's horror at how the German peasants take up the gospel that he's preached and use it to justify what they see as anarchy and rebellion. So it's like letting the, you know, genie out of the bottle and opening Pandora's box, really. And I think that language is very, very, very important in that regard. What it also does, though, is it actually helps to create these confessional and political blocks, because, you know, your sense of your religion and your sense of your identity as part of a wider community or nation are then cemented by language being at the centre as well. So I think it encourages that fluidity, but it also encourages some of those sort of moves towards institutionalization as well. I think the other thing I would say is that, of course, what brings about Luther's ideas about the transformative ideas about the mystery of salvation is rereading those texts and thinking about whether the words have been translated correctly. So translation is very, very powerful theme, and translation, is a word, of course, in my sensitivity language, that it explains the movement from one language to another, but also a movement from one place to another at the same time.
I wonder if I could just pick up on that. And I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is a piece of literature from the Reformation, which is Midsummer Night's Dream, O bottom, thou art translated. And the notion that shift, as it were, into a mythic world is a translation. So translation can take various forms. And I wondered whether you would want to comment on the way in which, arguably, the Reformation period was actually a time of the generation, not least through language, of extraordinary myths, not least, say, the myth of the New World through migration there, and how the sort of mythological dimension of what you're saying is an emergence from a much more static cosmology in the Middle Ages into a world that is seeking new religious myths, new expressions of one kind or another through language, but also through art and so on as well.
Thank you. I suppose what I'd say is that, we're all engaged in myth-making, aren't we, at every point in time, and the distinction between history and myth in any period is a matter of perspective, isn't it? And it's a polemical and an ideological distinction that's drawn. What they are engaged in this period, whether it's in the sphere of Christianity or in the sphere of their fascination in the context of the Renaissance with classical civilization, is this process of looking back, isn't it? And of recovering, whether you're recovering Christianity in its apostolic purity or you're recovering the glories of Greece and Rome, you are trying to recover something that is now lost in the mists of time, and that can therefore be constantly reinvented in the period. So I'm not sure I'm getting totally your question there, but that would be my response. Yeah.
Right, we have a question.
Do you see echoes of early modern religious movements in the way people experience belief in the 21st century?
Yes, of course I do. I think as I've been writing these lectures and researching them, I've been very conscious of the Gifford mandate that I must speak to subjects that actually raise larger questions about the modern human condition. It really has been a kind of voyage of discovery for me as well in thinking about how resonant some of the themes I've been exploring are. If you have listened to the lectures, you will have heard about how, going back to migration, so many of the challenges that we are facing and the mixed emotions and feelings and the political debates that take place around migration are echoed or anticipated in earlier periods. And also how, for example, questions about violence and about how we react to, the horrific events that are taking place in our world are also questions that people were facing in the 16th and 17th centuries in a context which was no less, if not more turbulent than our own. So yes, absolutely is the answer to that question. Yeah.
If I could just follow up on that, I think you've also helped us to connect with the early modern person and their understanding of the wholeness of being, looking past false Enlightenment narrative. One of the things that you've done really well is demonstrate continuity through the Enlightenment and moving past this Cartesian dichotomy between body and soul. And in an age where the NHS prescribes forest walks for mental well-being and mindfulness for physical well-being, I think what you've shown us is the similarities to early modern experience and the inability for us to push them back into a fanatic past when we were living in a fanatic present.
Exactly. Yeah, quite. I mean, you know, I think it's always a temptation, isn't it, that we push the past as an alternative space that's kind of generally worse than our own progressive, liberal, modern world. But, you know, we know how troubled and problematic our world is, and it was troubled and problematic back then too. Yeah.
Is there another question online? Yeah, sure. David, go ahead.
Could I just pick up? There's one word that's been going through my mind as you've been talking, and it's not memory as such, but nostalgia. And whether, in fact, nostalgia, in a certain sense, was born during the Reformation period. And nostalgia is something that is very powerful in our world, looking back to, you know, that golden time when we were young, and so on and so forth, that of course never existed. But whether in fact part of the journey and part of the development of the medieval memory frameworks was in fact an added dimension in the Reformation period of nostalgia for a world, a much more perceived to be stable world than any longer existed.
Can I just ask David there, do you think that nostalgia is dangerous?
In very brief, yes.
Yes, okay. We'll elaborate on that.
Thank you for that. I've thought quite a lot about nostalgia. In fact, co-edited a volume about nostalgia quite recently, and I think it is a fascinating and, you know, ambivalent concept, because it is about looking back to the past, but it's also frequently about inventing the present and, you know, projecting into the future as well. So it's a kind of temporally complex phenomenon. You might say that nostalgia is a kind of occupational hazard of a historian, really, isn't it? But on the other hand, we, you know, as a society, it's comforting for us to think, actually, well, the past was somehow either better than the terrible present that we live in, or that it was worse because it makes us feel better about the world that we live in. So it pulls in both those ways. And I do think the Reformation is a nostalgic project, isn't it? It's about looking back to an ancient Christian past and trying to recover it. And that's also really striking, because one of the things that has happened in the interim, I've stressed continuity, but something has happened, is that when we want to change the world, we don't really look to the past as the place to find the model or the pattern or the blueprint. We look forward to the future and think we can change that. And I think that is a fundamental shift in mentality that I'm not sure I have the answer to, but I think it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Oh, please go ahead.
It's a very dynamic period that you chose with the Reformation for religion, and you explained it very clearly. One thing I wasn't so clear about is, what did people's understanding of God do? Did it change? Because just to put it in context, if I take a philosopher, a natural philosopher from the beginning of your period, Isaac Newton, who wrote about his understanding of God, not necessarily worship of God, but understanding of it, and say Michael Faraday at the end of your period, who talked about the same God, and they both talked about the God in the same way in their interpretation of how he controlled us and gave us energy and power and so on. That didn't seem to have changed during the Reformation. I just wondered on your comments.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I mean, that's a huge question. I think once in my youth, it was misspent youth, clearly, but once in my youth I thought, oh, I think I'll take as my next project a history of God. That was a terrible idea, and I abandoned that very quickly, but I think it is a very interesting question. Yes, I think there are different ways in which people's conceptualization of the deity is both changing and also remaining the same. I alluded back to my earlier attempts to argue against a kind of disenchantment of the world, the idea that God or other forces intervene directly in the world, and the continuity in persisting views of thinking that God does intervene directly, but the mechanisms by which he does so are shifting. So, the Reformation says miracles have ceased, but actually, in some ways, it still retains a strong sense that God does intervene providentially in the world, but he may do so increasingly using, working within the boundaries of nature rather than, creating massive changes in, the usual order of the world. I think another way in which God's conceptions of God are changing is the Reformation also sees very powerful reassertion of the Old Testament, of a vengeful Jehovah, a punishing God, reassertion of the Mosaic Code. It must be put back into practice and so on. But you also see, by the end of the period, a turn towards thinking about God as a much more benevolent, a creator, and a God who actually has created this world that exemplifies his wisdom and that he doesn't need to tinker with anymore. But he's also a God who's merciful. And that's also a shift in temperament. You might say that people's conceptions of the emotions of God himself are slightly shifting. And again, I'm not claiming to know the precise reasons why that happens, but I think it's happening. Something is happening. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll take one more online and then come to you. There's a more? Okay, there's a gentleman here. Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. You've written in the past about relics, and I wondered if you could say in brief where your thinking is now about people's relationships with religious objects and the material culture of faith.
Thank you. Yes. Well, that's another big question. Yes, I think, there have been various trends in the historical discipline as more generally, and one of those, has been a turn towards mobility, a turn towards emotion, and a turn towards the material world. And I have been very interested in that. The Reformation, famously pours scorn on relic culture, on the idea that objects have sacred power, that they're conduits of the holy, and all of that. It sees massive forms of iconoclasm and destruction. One of the most fascinating tracts that Calvin writes is this sarcastic kind of inventory of the relics in Christendom. So the idea that objects should not be the subject of veneration or devotion is really at the heart of the Reformation. But our tendency to think, the Reformation is anti-material, anti-object, is kind of a product of paying too much attention to its own polemic. It creates, material culture and material objects that focus memory, which is what relics do, of its own. So, lots of examples might be given of that. That there's a kind of tendency for Protestants who witness the martyrdoms of their, heroes and their preachers to actually want to collect little mementos. And how do we understand what's going on there? Is that a throwback to this sort of human instinct to venerate things? Or is there something else going on there? And so that's what I'd say, but I'd also say that there's a very interesting way in which the Reformation creates domestic cultures of objects. It creates, household objects that are about reminding you of your faith, of inculcating moral values. I was passing John Knox's house yesterday and saw inscriptions. I'm fascinated by that. I want to write about that. But that idea that, the word, the physical word, is actually itself a kind of relic. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
In adding again, with the greatest of pleasure, my gratitude and that of your audiences all through these Gifford lectures, I'm reminded of my late colleague, James Macmillan, the French historian of France, who was the founder of our School of History at the University of Edinburgh in the 21st century, and who was always apt to say, especially when invited to prophecy or to extract from the past weather forecasts for the future, I'm a historian, my field is the past. And it occurs to me that we are in some danger. This, of course, is not a criticism of the commentators, and certainly not of the major lecturer. But we are in dangers of, shall we say, wrapping up the Middle Ages in those 1,500 years, and dear me, all how similar, aren't they? And are failing to see, shall we say, what a revolutionary the Venerable Bede might have been, or was. I want to say on that the history of the past is so often a question of the collision of different forms of historical perception. And that this, what you have done in your lectures so well, is, if I may say so, to stress that the history of religion is about religion, which is an invaluable point because secularism and materialism have done so much to lose track of the humanity which is there. But if to make one material point, you are talking with great eloquence and great wisdom about the insurrection of 1641 in Ireland yesterday in your lecture. And that was a fascinating case. And of course, you're using Aidan Clark's editions of the depositions very effectively. I was a friend of Aidan when I was a student, and I was very touched at that. But I was so aware also of the fact that there was at the back of it land, the disposition of people from land, their anxiety to retrieve it. And in the crises of the late 20th century, you could see in so many people, so many not realizing it, but that struggle over the land back in the late 15th and more particularly in the late 16th and in the early 17th century, that was at the back of the brutality of the insurrection and of so much that has happened since. And so we have to bear, shall we say, land as one of a variety of factors which have a permanent quality, but which also make us realize that there is an interaction between religion, motivation, justification, and loss and gain.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, I think that's all very thoughtful, and thank you so much for your appreciation of what I've tried to do. I think, I suppose one of the, motion always happens in tandem with its apparent opposite rest, doesn't it? And it also happens between places, between locations, between masses of land, yeah. And so, yes, that's always there, and that is a practical reality. I mean, you know, many of our problems today are really about, you know, land, aren't they? And they're about, you know, who should be on this piece of land, yeah? And that's a truth of history all through. That would be a great subject for the Gifford Lectures in the future, I think, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Do you want to add anything, Scott?
No, but I think, but yes. I would say one of the great things about the lectures you've given us is a challenge to not think about the Reformation and its energies as inherently teleological. And one of the challenges when we start with the political perspective is Ireland became more Catholic because the English tried to make it Protestant. In some respects, I mean, that's to oversimplify it. But what Professor Walsham has demonstrated to us is the embodiment of religion and the impact that it has on moving bodies, souls, minds, in ways that did find definitive resting points, but actually in the dynamism of the Reformation could have gone in radically different ways.
I just wonder if you could perhaps comment on an aspect of that embodiment, it seems to me, is the development of a notion of self-consciousness in a different kind of way. Now, I'm not a historian, but I wonder whether that's something that is a reasonable assertion. But one of the consequences of that is that this could be described as a period of new ways of thinking, different ways of thinking, not more necessarily complex or better, but simply new ways of thinking, which are often very conflicted. So that, to go back to theology again, I mean, theology in a certain sense didn't work after the Reformation period. I mean, Milton would be an obvious example of that he writes a poem which is a theological poem, but the theology doesn't work, it's dislocated, because different ways of thinking are conflicted within it. And whether part of the journey that you're describing, which is not least fueled by the emotions, is the advent of different, often conflicted and conflicting ways of thinking in which certain things like theology no longer were stable.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things I'd say in response to that is that, you know, we live in a world where it is second nature to us to accept there are different paths to religious truth. Some people don't necessarily actually think that, but I think, you know, we do live in that sort of world. And what's so striking about the period of the Reformation is that they began with a project to ensure that everybody adhered to a single version of the truth. That they inherited as a project from the Middle Ages. But in the course of what happens, how the Reformation unfolds, that project is placed under enormous strain. And from that emerges different ways of thinking. What emerges is the idea that there might be different paths to the truth, that actually truth is relative. And that it's that tension between those two positions that's actually fundamental, I think, to the dynamism of the period, and that creates different questions about conscience, for example. You know, you may not agree with what your neighbours, how they're worshipping, what they're believing, but when they're placed under pressure and they take certain steps, you cannot but admire what they've done, because it's how you should have behaved if you were in the same position. And that relativization of truth becomes, I think, a critical ingredient in this moving, fluid world that I've been trying to sort of capture in a sort of, snapshot. Yeah.
Please.
Our online audience member would like to ask each of you, what do you think is meant by the word emotion in the title of the talks?
Good question. Who wants to go first? I'll pick on you, Scott.
That seems slightly unfair since I didn't pick emotion. But I do, I've been struck by the scholarship in recent years on the history of emotion and that sense of the wholeness of the human being, not simply as an intellectual or a cultural product, but as the embodiment of an ontological reality. So I think emotion is that space where we express and feel what it is to be. And the Reformation provides a dynamic space in which people are encouraged to reimagine that. So interestingly, the Counter-Reformation and the vast majority of the Reformation embrace the idea of a magisterial format, that this should be some kind of uniform framework. And yet within that space, you get radically different ecclesiologies expressed by the Anabaptists who are beginning at a more atomized point. So round, circular, it is what is to be human, I think, emotion.
Well, to sort of put a kind of almost opposite view of that, or at least to balance that, it seems to me there's a negative side, because while, to find one's emotions is clearly an important part of what it is to be human, it also has a pejorative and a negative aspect to it. So that's merely an emotional response. You need to think more carefully about it, or even the implications of kind of childishness. And I think that's a kind of tension that continues through Romanticism, for example, and then it finds itself in the 19th century where you have, the emotional, i.e. non-intellectual evangelicals, as opposed to the over-intellectualized, non-emotional high church party, and so on and so forth. I mean, those are broad generalizations, but it sets at tension one another. To be emotional is a good thing, but it's also a dangerous thing. To be over-intellectual is to lose track of one's emotions and to be cold and dry and arid, and yet at the same time. So I think it's both.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that my starting point here, I think I said it before, is that actually those words motion and emotion are used interchangeably in the period. Emotion is not the most common word they use to describe what we call emotions. It's passions, it's affects. But they do talk about the emotions of the spirit or the emotions of the earth. And so it is literally about movement. That's what's at the center of it. I think you're absolutely right that, and I have used it as a kind of shorthand for a more complex and a different way of thinking about feeling and affect than perhaps we have in our post-Cartesian world. But emotion is been secularized, hasn't it? And it's integrally a religious concept in the period I'm talking about. It's about the movements of your soul, and so we have to sort of do that. But I think I'd also just respond to what you say about that anti-intellectual quality. I mean, from the beginning in the Reformation, people were using that language of emotion to castigate tendencies that they didn't approve of. In yesterday's lecture, I talked about enthusiasm as the way that you condemned that. And those sorts of arguments are constantly played out They're played out right back in biblical times. So that's part of the kind of rhetorical contest that's taking place, the weaponization of emotion. If you don't like what your neighbor is doing, you say, it's mere emotion, isn't it? Or, actually, it's not just emotion, it's an emotional disorder as well. It's a kind of madness or an insanity. And that's a classic technique that we all use to describe things that disturb us or frighten us. And that should give us pause for thought, I think.
Please, gentleman at the back.
Thank you for an excellent discussion. There was a book a few years ago called The Persuasion Industries by someone who's interested in advertising and the fact that they had moved from rational persuasion, i.e. this car does more miles to the gallon, to the use of affect, and to the idea that manipulation of affect is actually a surer route to changing behaviour and belief than rational persuasion. And certainly there are times in the clinic when you can feel that too.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think we're living in a world where, and I'm really not a person that's kind of participating in the kind of social media world, but I am really struck by how affect is everything, actually, isn't it? And that must itself be affecting how we are living our lives and how people are experiencing, the challenges of life. You might say we're kind of living in an age which is actually very distrustful of reasoned argument, actually, in a way. We don't need experts, do we, anymore? But, I suppose what I've also been saying is that this is not new. We've been there before. It's coming around, and it goes around in the same way. So that's maybe a lesson that these things will turn again. There'll be a kind of counter-reaction against that at some point in the future. But going back to the persuasion industry, that's a really interesting phrase. Our kind of media world, you increasingly do feel that the sands are very unstable under your feet. It's really hard to work things out. People are living in kind of bubbles of their own opinion. But I would also say that having read vast outpouring of the press in the mid-17th century, that's what they felt too. Yeah.
Anyone else? Please.
Thank you. This is just a really quick question. I've loved the whole series. The motion in emotion, I already used in a talk I did last week. I picked it up and grabbed it for you and took it on in relation to material culture. We're both from the museum. Just a really quick question, which is this going into a book?
Well, I'm just sort of hoping to survive the lecture series, and then I'll think further about what I might do with it. But it's been, as I said, a journey of discovery, and I think that journey might continue into a book form, but possibly not immediately. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else online? Comments? Any final reflections from our panelists?
It's just one question that's been circling in my mind all evening. We speak a great deal, or you speak a great deal of conversion, And then great emphasis is later placed on that, particularly in the evangelical, that one has to experience conversion as a great event. But I wonder how much in the Reformation itself, and I'm thinking specifically of the sort of English Reformation of the mid-16th century, actually most people were quite adept at avoiding conversion because they would readily adapt, as it were. I'm thinking of the kind of echoes of Morbarth sort of syndrome, where you readily adapt but don't really change according to the political shifts that go on. So that actually religion is a deeply conservative element in most people's lives, actually, in which you can comfortably adapt to a new political situation, but actually not change at all and go back to the old position when Queen Mary comes along, and so on and so forth. And wonder whether you could comment on that kind of tension between perceiving the Reformation as a period of great change and conversion. Suddenly everybody became a Protestant. Well, actually, no, most people were probably pretty unaware of what they were. They just wanted to go on being the same all the time.
Thank you. Well, that takes us to the heart of the questions about the Reformation that I've been grappling with forever, really. I mean, yesterday I mentioned that, one of the consequences of some of the trends in historical thinking I've been describing is actually to move away from this meta-narrative of conversion and to say, well, as you say, that most people kind of pragmatically rolled with the times and opportunistically did what was necessary to keep going. But I mean, I think I'd take myself back to where I started. My original postgraduate work was exactly about those people who conformed, who outwardly went along with that. And what that taught me was that, that it may be a problem of our perspective to say that those people are just rolling with the times. They're deeply conflicted about these things. And that process of thinking, what do I do now at this point? And also later then thinking, what did I do? And was that right? And how can I reinvent it so it sounds better? So it's part of this kind of mobility and this sort of tension. That's there. That's at the heart of it. I suppose I've always been interested in paradox, and these are the central paradoxes of the Reformation that make it such a fascinating thing to work on.
Just, I guess, take an opportunity to thank you once again, and to remind us that these individuals functioned beyond themselves, that emotion was the way that they understood a response to God, to their own circumstances, their changing circumstances, and that cannot be sanitized from our understanding of the human experience.
And just one final question from me, Alex. When you started this series of lectures, and you will be finishing tomorrow, what was the one or two surprising things that you found that you hadn't anticipated that changed your own thinking?
I might need to think about that further. Yeah, I think I was saying to you earlier that when you start a research project and you're asked to give a title and abstracts about that, and often you haven't quite finished writing the lectures themselves. And so actually what's really struck me is how my instinct that motion and emotion go together and are interesting lenses through which to look at this period has actually manifested itself, over and over again. That actually, just to take one example, and they say travel, that's about travail, about trouble, yeah. All of these things have this double kind of resonance, and everything is about motion, really, isn't it? Yeah, and the patterns, they're sort of the patterns that I've begun to see have really surprised me, and it surprised me also how a lot of the things that I've worked on in the past have come back in and been seen in a different light.
Just a very quick question for me is feeling the same as emotion?
Oh, gosh, these are hard questions, aren't they? Is feeling the same as emotion? I don't know, that might start a whole new conversation, mightn't it? They do use the word feeling a lot, and they use it more. They use it more than they use emotion, yeah. So and maybe that is something I think is a very helpful observation, that that's one word I have not interrogated in the course of these lectures, and I need to do so. Thanks, Mona. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the panel, Professor David Jasper and Professor Scott Spurlock. And thank you to you for being here, for giving up your time. To our online audience, please join me in thanking Professor Alex Walsham. Thank you so much.